Hi there, Andrew here. Welcome back to the studio. In this short video, I'm going to share with you my top 5 tips for varnishing. Don't go anywhere. Now, I've received a lot of requests for this video, and I'm going to share with you my exact process for how I varnish my oil paintings. But before we get into it, you might be wondering, why would we want to varnish a painting in the first place? Well, have you ever experienced this, where you're painting in the studio, you've finished your painting, and then you notice that the surface goes patchy between matte and gloss, and the texture seems to be a little bit uneven? Well, a varnish could actually improve this situation by making it a nice even surface of a nice even sheen and even improve the colors. So that's number 1, to improve the surface quality and the color. And number 2 is varnish actually offers a protective layer over that painting so that it can endure the years after we put on our last brush strokes. But before we get into any varnishing at all, and before I share with you a couple of my techniques for how I go about it, let's cover some ground rules first, just over here at the blackboard. Now, these are my top 5 tips for varnishing, things that I think you've got to consider if you're going to varnish a painting. Number 1 is your painting has got to be dry. Now, there's a rule out there, and I try to stick to this as often as possible, that your painting has got to be dry for at least 6 to 12 months before you attempt to varnish. Now again, we're talking about oil paintings here. With acrylics, it's going to be slightly different. So with an oil painting, after you put on those final marks, you want to make sure it's dry for at least 6 months. Oil continues to shift and move for a long time after you put on those final brush strokes. And even though it might be touch dry and it doesn't feel sticky or wet, it's still moving and doing its thing. So number 1, your painting's got to be dry. Number 2, you've got to be applying the varnish in a nice clean and dust-free environment, because the varnish is naturally very sticky. As it's drying, it's going to attract that dust to the surface. So you've got to make sure you're doing this in as clean a studio as you possibly can. Number 3, you've got to be using the correct varnish for the job. And in this demo, I'm going to talk to you about a few different kinds of varnish and also some that you should avoid. Number 4, you've got to be applying your varnish flat, laying the painting down dead flat so that you don't create any uneven surface. And while we're speaking of surface, you've got to have a nice, thin, and uniform covering of varnish over the entire surface. And I'm going to show you some techniques to achieve just that. So those are my top 5 tips. Now you might be wondering, okay, if I finished my painting, I can't wait 6 to 12 months. The client's waiting for it, or my exhibition has got to hang on the wall. So what do I do in that scenario? If I want to have a nice, crisp surface on that oil paint so everything's nice and even and it's got a really nice sheen and the color is all there in the painting, what do I do then? Well, I've got a little trick. I use a retouch varnish. Now, we're going to apply some retouch varnish now. I'm going to go and get this painting. This has been hanging in the studio for a little while. You might remember this as the sketch or the study in my recent portrait tutorial. Now, I've had this hanging in the studio for the last several months, and I've noticed that some areas are nice and gloss, and some areas are quite matte and dull. So we need to even this out. Now, as we've discussed, you'll know that rule of waiting 6 to 12 months for your painting to completely dry before applying a final varnish. But here, we're using retouch varnish. So not quite a final varnish, which means we can get away with covering the canvas with this a little bit sooner than that 6-month mark. Generally, depending on what I've painted with, I can apply this to some sunken areas within a couple of weeks, if I've used liquid in particular. Now, this particular brand of retouch is Art Spectrum, and I quite enjoy using this. I've had a lot of experience with this product. Again, Art Spectrum isn't a sponsor. I just really enjoy using this, and I've gotten really predictable results with it. Now, what this is ketone resin suspended in a solvent. It's got a nice open surface, so if I apply it lightly to my painting, it will allow that painting to continue to breathe and oxidize and polymerize through those layers whilst it's got a nice uniform satin finish given by the retouch. So before we get going with any kind of varnish, it's important that we have a couple of clean jars handy. Also, a couple of rags. Here I've just got some plain white t-shirt material. Love that stuff. And of course, some paper towel for cleanup. And I'm going to be using this nice soft mop brush from Rosemary & Co. And this one is my favorite for applying the retouch. And it's just going to be a light technique over the surface. Let's get started. So the first thing I do when I'm applying retouch to a painting is I decant a little bit into a small clean jar first. Now again, making sure I've got some rags handy and some paper towel in case I need a bit of cleanup. The first thing I'm going to do is just get a touch on the end of that brush there and then begin working in an area. And I'm going to apply this a bit strategically, and again, not over the whole painting. I'm just going to begin to lift out the areas that have gone dull. And here, the area that's gone really dull is that area right on the face with all of those light skin tone colors. So I can see as I get my head down and I'm looking at the angle in the light, I can see what has a sheen and what's matte. And so I want this all to have a nice even sheen. So I'm going to start working in that matte dull area and see if we can get a bit of this color to lift back out. And I'm just going to brush lightly across the surface of the face. And I can see that that is starting to lift. And just a little bit of this retouch varnish goes a long way. Now I'm not scrubbing the surface, I'm just gently brushing it across, just piece at a time. And already it's bringing out all of those dark tones. And I really only loaded my brush once, just a touch, and just lightly brushing across the surface. Again, I'm not laying on a thick candy coat of this stuff. Now a retouch varnish like this will get this painting to what I call exhibition ready. It won't be the final varnish layer by any means, but just a very small, thin amount makes a world of difference and would actually improve the overall results when you're hanging it in your exhibition or on the client's wall. Now this varnish has made a significant difference to the surface of this painting. I'm pretty happy with the way this looks. Again, keeping that nice and thin, and I'm avoiding going over the same areas that I've just been to make sure that I don't remobilize any paint. Now I'm not too worried about it in this case with this little portrait because the paint is probably about 2 or 3 months old on that surface. But if it was fresher, I might run the risk of having the solvent component of that retouch varnish going in and lifting my paint layers. Personally, I've not had much experience of any paint lifting as long as I've used plenty of liquid as I'm building up my layers of paint. Now, what's the rag for, you might be wondering? Well, if I get too much varnish out on that rag, I can just wipe it off, wipe the brush off on there, get some of that excess off, and then get back to reworking that surface. And I'm just continually checking in the light to see how even that surface is. I'm pretty happy with this overall. So this would be really good to go back in its frame, on display, on the gallery wall, or in the client's house for several more months, even years, before a final varnish is needed. But generally, I like to get a final varnish on those paintings within about a year. Now, just a little tip. As you're brushing across the surface here, you might find the odd stray hair coming off your brush. That's quite normal. It's just important that you pick it up as you go. You want to make sure you don't leave any bristles on that surface because they'll dry and then they could form an annoying ridge line as that painting really hardens. It's very difficult to remove after, but while it's still wet, you just pick it right up again and you're good to go. And again, I'm just checking in the light to make sure that everything is nice and even. I'm very happy with that overall. It seems that the colors have really come back out. Now, retouch, along with many other varnishes, can be a little bit on the nose, so it's best to do this in an open area or in a studio with lots of ventilation. I still would recommend doing this indoors though, because you can't control the environment outside and it would be terrible to get dust on the surface of your painting. So as long as you've got maybe some extraction system or a nice big open space like I've got here, then that can be really beneficial for your paintings. Also, after I've done a batch of varnishing, I get out of the room, so I'm not breathing in all those fumes. I'm very happy with the way this retouch went down. The painting has been brought back to a really nice luster, almost like when I put those final brush marks on the portrait. Now, you saw me apply this varnish here with the painting laying flat, and that is one of those ground rules. In fact, it's number 4 on our list of top 5 tips for varnishing. However, with retouch, we don't need to adhere to that rule quite so strictly. It is okay to apply retouch, again, just to lift out some areas of the painting that have gone dull or sunken in. And sometimes we have to do this at the easel, provided it's been enough drying time between painting sessions and we're not going to remobilize that paint. Now, sometimes I'm working on paintings that are so large that it's problematic to lay them down completely flat. They have to stay up on the wall easel. Let's talk about another application for retouch with a recent project of mine. Now, you might be familiar with this painting here. I put the final brush strokes on this maybe about 3 weeks ago, but some areas could use a little bit of a lift. So it's all right to go ahead and go over that with a bit of retouch varnish. Now, again, here I used plenty of Winsor Newton liquid, so that surface is nice and dry. And I'm noticing here, as I look across the surface, I can see that this is going from matte to gloss, and even some areas that I've applied some glazing, it's gone very uneven indeed. So we need to bring this back up to its original luster. Now, believe it or not, we're going to apply the exact same technique using the same size brush and only one little bit at a time. It might be daunting with a painting that's 2.5 meters across, but hey, it's time consuming, I know, but that's what painting's all about. We've got to do a good job and we have to do it properly. So I've got the same brush as before and a rag as well handy in case I get too much of that varnish out across the surface, and I just need to wipe the bristles back across that rag. And I'm just going to select one area, one piece where I can clearly define those edges and just make sure I work within one zone at a time, and again, just lightly brushing across that surface. And I'm going to work with this zone right here where that glaze of that sky highlights coming down, shining on the mountainside here. I've noticed it's gone very matte right here, and either side it's slightly glossier. So we're going to sort out this area. So we're just going to go, again, just piece at a time, and I'm going to work it to the edge of those trees, and we're going to go right across the surface. And as I do that, it just lifts that color back out again. And it's just one small brush stroke at a time. And while I'm doing this, I'm checking the reflection of the light to make sure that I've got it evenly across that surface. And as I'm going here, I'm just working edge to edge. So I can see the edge of where that retouch was from my previous application, and then I can just go and work into that edge slightly. I'm very careful not to go back and rework a surface after that varnish has been applied, just in case I mobilize some of that paint film that I deposited a couple of weeks ago. So I don't want to lift any of my color. I want this to sit on top really nice and evenly. I'm just going very evenly and very methodically with just the end of that brush. And I prefer working in this method, to be honest. Now, yeah, it might be quicker to use an aerosol spray application for retouching, but it's always my preference to go by hand, slowly and methodically, and really do as good a job as possible. That's going to have a couple of benefits to it. One, I've got the control over the process, and two, I'm not releasing a bunch of unnecessary fumes into the studio air. Now, if you've been painting for a while, you're no doubt familiar with Damar varnish. A lot of artists have been using this for a long while, and it's not something that I commonly use in the studio. I've used it here and there, but there are some ground rules that we're going to need to cover with this product in particular, and I want to draw your attention again to some of those points we were discussing at the start of this video. But Damar can be quite handy for bringing up the luster and the glossiness of our painting and can provide a really nice finish. The drawbacks to this product are it can be a little bit brittle, and also it has a tendency to darken over time. Now, I'm referring to two books in particular when it comes to Damar varnish, and that is Virgil Elliott's book called Traditional Oil Painting and also Michael Wilcox's book called Glazing. Two fantastic resources for painters. Links to those are in the description down below, and they do discuss Damar. And generally, because of what they've said, that's why I tend to avoid this. But here, with a little en plein air study, which was painted outside about a year ago when I was with my buddies Samuel Earp and Freeman White, I knocked out this little study. It's good and dry, so we're okay to go ahead and varnish this. And I just want to bring up the luster of this surface. It's not too bad, but I want to offer also a layer of protection here. Now I've got a nice clean jar here, and I'm going to decant just a little bit of this Damar into the jar. Now I'm going to be using this wide bristle varnishing brush. I quite like using these for a varnish job like this, and I want to be traveling quite quickly. Now it's important when I'm using Damar to keep the work nice and flat, in particular if I'm varnishing over a bigger panel, because this stuff can have the tendency to run. Again, I've got my rag handy just to wipe off any of the excess. And we're just going to start at the top left of the painting. Now I want to do this as even as I possibly can, making sure that I'm working from the left to right and from the top to the bottom in nice, long, even strokes. And I'm also very conscious that I don't go back over and rework the same surface that has had that varnish applied. I don't go back and rework that too much, just in case I mobilize any of that pigment. But because it's been a nice long time, we shouldn't run into much danger of that at all. It's had plenty of time to dry. And just get a little bit of that excess off on a rag. We'll just smooth it out just a little bit, even run up the edge there. Now there we go. Now I'm using nice long even strokes, and I'm not too worried about remobilizing any of that pigment. I was using plenty of that liquid original out there in the field, and it's had over a year to dry, so I should be just fine with applying this Damar. And if I get a little too much out, that's what the rag's for. Just go back and wipe some of that excess off onto the rag and just continue to work that surface until such a point as you feel you've got a nice even coat on there. Now we do want to leave this nice and flat to go ahead and dry. That should take roughly a couple of hours to set up, but I'm going to leave this laying flat overnight while this varnish goes off and cures. And we'll come back and check what this looks like tomorrow. Now I've got another little study over here that I'm going to apply some varnish to. Now you might think I'm being a little bit silly here, but there's something about this painting that's quite special to me. Now, I went back and forth in my mind as to whether I would pick each one of these sandflies off the surface of this painting. But you know what? Now that I think about it, I really quite like them there because they touch on that experience of standing there on the shores of Milford Sound with my buddies Freeman and Sam and just capturing that moment where we were surrounded by a cloud of these things. So it just brings a smile to my face. So I'm going to mummify these sandflies to the best of my ability in a very light layer of Damar varnish, and I'm going to try to keep them there. So we're going to go nice and delicately, again just applying the same technique. And we're going to start again from the top left and just working our way gently across that surface. And let's make those sandflies sorry they ever landed in my painting. Now I'm constantly on the lookout for any stray hairs. It might seem a bit funny because I'm not worried about sandflies, but if I see a bristle just sticking out, I'll either pick it off the brush, there's one there, and I'll make sure that it hasn't been left on the surface of that painting, because that could form quite a problem later down the track. So there we go. I think that painting is going to be nice and sealed, and I don't think those sandflies are going anywhere anytime soon. And after a few days, once that's gone really nice and hard, I'll go ahead and think about putting them back in their frame, but I'm going to leave this to dry flat again overnight. So again, we'll just cover a couple of those ground rules when it comes to using Damar varnish. First up, remember Damar varnish has the tendency to be brittle, so you'll want to do this on a rigid support. Here, I'm painting over two panels that aren't moving. It's not a stretch canvas, so there's not going to be any warp or flex in that surface at all. So I'm going to be nice and safe, and I'm going to avoid cracking a brittle surface. The other thing is that this has the tendency to darken and yellow a little bit over time. So I wouldn't be doing this on a bigger painting that might be sensitive to that. So here, these little en plein air 8x10 studies that I did out in the field, this is just fine to use for this kind of application. Now, I have heard of artists out there using Damar varnish in their mediums, and whilst this approach is okay, there's a couple of things you need to be aware of. Damar is really soluble, so just a little bit of solvent will remobilize it. Now, if this is mixed in with your paint layers, then that could be potential disaster for your painting. As you begin to add more and more layers with this stuff mixed in, you could potentially remobilize what you've already put down. So if you're going to do that and you're going to have this in some of your medium, make sure it's reserved for those topmost layers only. Personally, my favorite approach when it comes to mediums is just using the Winsor & Newton Liquin range. They're very forgiving, really fast drying, and easy to layer. So we've talked a little bit about retouch varnish, and now you've seen something on Damar varnish. Let me show you my favorite varnishing technique for the way I really finish off my oil paintings. Now, you might remember this landscape here. This is the winter landscape that I painted last year, and it's had a good year to dry, and we're going to apply that final varnish. But there's a couple of steps first that I must do before I apply that varnish, otherwise I have the risk of really damaging this painting. So the first step is to just check the surface and make sure it's nice and clean. This has been hanging in my house for a while. Whilst I try to keep as clean a home as possible, there's still going to be dust in the air. Skin cells and various substances that are floating around will accumulate and deposit on the surface of that, and I don't want to trap those on this painting. I want to make sure I get this as clean as possible. First step is get a nice big dry brush here, and this one I haven't used for painting at all. I keep this specifically to dust and brush off the surface of paintings. So I'm just going to go across here and just make sure that there's no dust, there's no accumulation of anything. And then I'm ready for the second step. Now that our painting is thoroughly dust-free, it's time to give it a thorough clean. Now, I want to go ahead and clean this after a year because it's been in one of these open, common areas of my house where it's near the kitchen and there might be some suspended oil particles in the air that could have accumulated on the surface here. So I want to make sure that I get everything to a nice, even clean. So to do this, I've got a pro tip that came directly from an art conservator friend of mine. Now here I'm going to be using ammonium hydroxide or cloudy ammonia, and you can just get this from any department store, hardware store, at the grocery store. So here I'm just going to use about 20 mils, so just a capful, roughly, in a nice clean jar. And about 250 mils of water. So a cup of water, roughly. There we go. And that's about the strength of the solution that I'm going to use to clean this canvas here. Now, before I start cleaning, I'm going to make sure I put on a pair of these rubber gloves to protect my hands. I don't want any of that ammonium hydroxide getting on my skin. It can cause a bit of an irritation. But generally, with a solution this week, I'm not going to react to it too badly. And I'm just going to use a little bit of this on a nice clean rag, and we're going to go slowly and methodically across the canvas. Now for my rags, if I didn't already mention, I'm using just plain white t-shirt material. Now this polyester mixed with cotton is pretty good as a painting rag. It doesn't drop too much in terms of fiber. It's nice and clean, but also I can see if there's going to be any residue that's going to come off the surface of the painting, it's going to accumulate on the surface of that rag, and I can tell the effectiveness of the cleaning, or I can also tell if I've mobilized some of that paint, heaven forbid. Again, this painting is over a year old, so we're well and truly within the right time range to be able to varnish this and also clean it before we do a final varnish. Now I'm not pressing too hard. I'm just gently rubbing on the surface, and then with a dry rag, just come back and wipe off the excess. and then repeat. And I'll just keep going across the surface like this, just checking it one patch at a time. Now, generally, if I work in sections or patches, I know where I've been, and I'm just going one square patch at a time. Rather than starting in the middle and working my way out, it can be difficult to keep track of where I'm going. So here, just one patch and moving from either right to left or left to right, up to down, just whatever method works for you. But I do have something right there. I need to sort out what the hell that is. There's something sticking up in it right there. Wasp.
You're kidding.
There's a wasp behind the painting. This is why we clean our paintings, folks. Did you see that little guy? Right, let's make sure he gets varnished into the painting. Oh, gee. I was pushing against there going, well, I wonder what is this lump that I'm feeling? It's really good. I'm actually encouraged by this because I'm not seeing a whole lot of dirt coming off the surface. But with a painting that had been really, really old, I definitely want to do this step before varnishing it. And again, I'm not pushing very hard. It's just a light touch, just gently going across the surface and then going back and just drying off, wiping up any of the excess of where I've been. All right, so I'm just checking the surface. I'm pretty happy with that cleanup job. I got a little bit of excess dirt back off the surface, but it wasn't too bad. But I feel very confident that I'm ready to do that final varnish. Now, before I apply that final varnish, there's one last step. I need to let this dry for at least 24 hours to make sure that it's completely bone dry before I seal in that painting. If there's moisture trapped between the varnish layer and the painting, that can cause this thing called blooming, where you can get these opaque patches spreading underneath that varnish layer. We don't want any of that, so I'm just going to make sure that all that excess is lifted up and then has got time to evaporate out into the studio air. So 24 hours, we're going to let this dry. We're going to come back tomorrow. Now I'm ready to apply the final varnish, but before I show you my technique here, let me just tell you about this video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes ranging in a whole variety of topics. I personally use Skillshare to take my art business a little bit further. It's got all sorts of classes from all kinds of creative pursuits and also entrepreneurial skills. Premium membership gives you unlimited access so you can join the classes and communities that are just right for you. Whether you want to fuel your curiosity, your creativity, or even your career, Skillshare is the perfect place to keep you learning and thriving. Now, you've no doubt heard me talk about Skillshare before. I absolutely love using their product as a paying customer. So I'm using Skillshare to learn more about video editing, and also I'm learning about After Effects. Previously, I've used Skillshare to learn some about Photoshop, and I took a class by somebody called Gabriel Bricky, and now I'm learning about After Effects with a guy named Jake Bartlett. Now I'm progressing with these classes. I'm building up my skills a little bit. You guys are going to see the benefit of that very, very soon. Skillshare is also incredibly affordable. Think about how expensive in-person classes can be. But here with Skillshare, you can learn for less than $10 a month. Now, because Skillshare is sponsoring this video, you can sign up with that link in the description down below and get yourself a free 2-month trial. Now, a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and I just want to let you know that I'm only going to be working with sponsors who have a product that I actually use, and it can take my art business further. I'm using Skillshare as a paying customer, and I really believe in the product. So make sure you check it out by clicking that link in the description down below. Now, let's get on to varnishing this painting. Okay, we're ready to go with the final varnish. Let me explain a little bit about what you're seeing here. I've got a kettle full of boiling water. Important. I also have a bowl and a jar that has been preheated, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. And I've got this product here. This is Winsor & Newton Final Varnish, Final Picture Varnish, and I have it in gloss and matte. And what I'm going to do is combine the two to make satin. Now, Winsor & Newton do offer a satin varnish. However, I want to be in control of how much sheen is in that final picture varnish and have it be a little bit more on the matte side. Sometimes I feel some varnishes can be a little too glossy, and this is some trouble that I've had in the past. It makes the work a little bit more difficult to view. So here, if I'm in control of this and I add a little bit more matte to that gloss, I'm going to end up with a really nice finish. So I've got these two ready to go. And here, what I'm going to want to do is pour the boiling water into the bowl. I don't want to get any water in the jar at all. Now, I've got a couple of these bristle varnish brushes. They're nice and cheap. I like using these for varnishing because I want to go nice and slow by hand. I want to get a very nice even coat. Again, remember, point number 5 on that board for the top 5 tips of varnishing is we must have a thin, even, and uniform coat of varnish, and this will help me do that. Now, it can drop a couple of fibers, so I got another clean brush here to just lift those off as they fall. Got those set aside there. Oh, and I'm forgetting, I need some rags. So I've got some clean rags here as well, just in case. Now, the first thing I want to do is just agitate this matte varnish just slightly. It has microcrystalline wax in there, along with some solvents. I don't want to shake it up because I don't want to put any air bubbles in there. So I want this a little bit more matte, so I'm going to have some more matte to that gloss varnish, so I don't have quite so much sheen on the surface. Normally I find that paintings can be quite glossy, and when they're really shiny, there's quite a glare from the lights that they're displayed under, can make it difficult to view the painting. But then too much matte and it can appear quite dull, so we need to find the right balance. So I'd say generally I keep to about 3/5 matte varnish, 2/5 gloss varnish. I would use a double boiler, except I don't have one. So just a jar, preheated of course, because if this is a cold jar and it goes in contact with that boiling water, it can end up breaking. We can have quite a mess on our hands. So just a jar suspended here in some boiling water is perfect. I'm going to be very careful with any drips as well, that they don't come in contact with that painting. Again, trying to keep moisture away from the surface of the painting because I want to avoid anything that resembles blooming. And blooming is moisture trapped between the varnish layer and the painting. It can be quite a problem down the track. So I'm going to apply the varnish here in a very slow and methodical way, working from the left to the right, from the bottom towards the top, or from the top left to the right and down towards the bottom. Whichever way is fine, just as long as we start covering this in a series of stripes and gradually moving all the way across the painting. That way I can ensure I get a nice thin and even coat. I can see pretty clearly in the reflection where the varnish has gone and where it's a little bit dry and may need a bit more. Because the painting is over 12 months old, I can go back and retouch some of these strokes and work back and forth just a touch, as long as I'm not vigorously scrubbing the surface of the painting. This should avoid me lifting any of that paint. Already I can see all of those colors coming right back out of the painting. Just like when I laid those final detail brush marks on there, that color comes back to life. It's amazing how much it dulls over time. So adding a layer of varnish can be quite a confidence boost. I'm on the lookout for any hairs in case I drop any of these fibers. I need to make sure I pick them up immediately. Now, even though this varnish is removable down the track and it can be restored, this painting can be taken care of by a conservator, it's going to be quite a nuisance to have a fiber trapped in that surface. I certainly wouldn't want it to bother a client or even me if I end up with this painting on my wall. It's going to be a bit of a nuisance, so we make sure that we pick those up as we drop them. I just love how the varnish reveals that beautiful color. It really does deepen the areas of darker tone, and it evens it out with those areas of lighter tone. But all that richness and saturation suddenly comes right back to life. Now this should be dry, ready to lean up against the wall in about an hour. It's already starting to go sticky, so it's my chance now to make sure I get a nice even coat. Again, remembering tip number 5. Now I'm really happy with the way this varnish is going down. I'm doing my best to achieve a nice, thin and even coat, constantly checking with the light to see where those glossy and matte patches are and making sure there's no dry areas on that surface. Again, I'm constantly on the lookout for any stray hairs that may have been dropped, and I just pick those up as I go. Now a painting of this size, which is 1.2 meters by 80 centimeters, will take me about 15 minutes to varnish. By the time I put on the last strokes at the end of this process, the first strokes that I put on are still quite sticky. Now it'll take an hour to 2 hours to become surface dry, but I want to make sure it's dry all the way through, so I leave this laying flat overnight. Now it's the very next day and I couldn't be happier. While I was applying this final varnish, I was checking in the reflection of the light to make sure there were no dry patches. And now this painting on the wall is totally dry. That final varnish has completely cured and it has achieved a nice even luster. Now I try to stay away from really glossy varnishes, and similarly I stay away from really matte varnishes. I'm going for something right in the middle at a satin finish, but a little more towards the matte side of satin. This makes the painting a little easier to view in my mind, because when we're looking at it under gallery display lights, it's not showing this awful glare that bounces back at our eyes. It's a nice even sheen and everything appears to be correct to the eye. Now again, let's just cover those top 5 tips that I mentioned at the start of this video. For tip number 1, we have to ensure that our painting is completely dry before applying a final varnish. Oil paintings take typically 6 to 12 months to completely cure before we seal them in with that final varnish. Now, of course, if you're working with acrylics, this is going to be different. And I also showed you in this video retouching, which can be done a lot sooner than that 6-month mark. Now, for tip number 2, we have to apply the final varnish in a clean and dust-free environment. It'd be a shame to have any particles of dust trapped in that final varnish layer. Now for tip number 3, we have to use the right varnish for the job. I've shown you a few of the varnishes that I like to use in this video, but I'm going to have a chat to you about some that you should avoid. Now for tip number 4, we must apply our final varnish with the painting laying flat. That varnish wants to drip and run, and so in order to achieve a thin, even, and uniform coat, that painting must be laying flat, and we have to do our utmost to spread that varnish out evenly. And again, that's tip number 5 for achieving a thin, even, and uniform coat. We must use the correct technique, working in a systematic way from top to bottom or from bottom to top, in whichever way works for you, but a systematic way to ensure that we get an even coat all the way across the surface. Now this has turned out to be quite a long video. Hopefully it's something that you can keep coming back to if ever you have a question about varnishing. But I did mention something during this video that I want to take this opportunity to cover now, and that's about varnishes that you should not use. When it comes to oil painting, there are particular varnishes for the job. A varnish is not simply a varnish. We have to use the correct varnish. So sometimes we get these really cool things from the hardware store in these fancy looking paint tins, and we're even told by people at the paint counter that we can use this to cover just about anything. I've heard of so many horror stories and absolute disasters from artists who have used things like polyurethane on their artwork. The trouble with this is you cannot remove it, and it darkens and yellows considerably over time. It creates quite a mess, and it's an art restorer's nightmare. Now these products are great for their intended purpose, used on timber decks or wooden furniture. But when it comes to your fine art, your specially crafted oil paintings, something you've poured your heart and soul into, it pays to go the extra mile and use the right varnish for the job. Now, a huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and I hope you take a minute to check out what Skillshare has to offer. There are so many different things there to help you on your creative journey. And now is the perfect time to take advantage of that free 2-month offer. Simply click that link in the description down below. Well, I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please hit that like button for me. If you want to come back for more and see more tutorials just like this one, my Creative Endeavor podcast, or my new Sketch Endeavor series, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification icon so you're notified when I upload another video. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook, but most important, make sure you're subscribed through my website. It's absolutely free to do so. Simply go to www.andrewtischler.com/subscribe, enter your name and email address there, and I'm in touch with my subscribers regularly. And most important, you get these YouTube videos 24 hours ahead of the rest. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you again soon.